There is, in Nova Scotia, handed down through the generations of her family, a remarkable diary, a daily journal kept by a First World War nurse named Claire Gass. On October 30th, 1915, she copied down a 15-line poem written by one of the doctors in her hospital. Claire Gass made a little bit of history that day, for this is the earliest written record of the poem's existence. All the words of war ever written, it is these simple, remarkable words which have become the most quoted, the most remembered, and for many, the most moving. Less than 100 words that linger forever over the graves of the long-dead boys, hover in remembrance over their short-lived lives. Inspired by the bombing death of a young officer, the words were captured and shaped by an exhausted Canadian named John McCrae. Words fused together in a foreign land, in a foreign and long ago time, in Flanders fields.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row that mark our place. And in the sky, the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields.
In Flanders Field is a poem that every mother, every father who had lost a son in that war could apply to their son. Many of the other poems could only be applied to the author. They're in fact poems about the author. And McCrae's medical background, I often think, comes out in that poem. There is a man who's used to seeing other people's suffering. And some of the very best war poetry was written by people for whom suffering was not a shock or a surprise. McCrae, I think, fits very firmly into that category. He's writing a poem for all the young men that he'd seen through his dressing stations. He's not writing it for himself.
Never in the history of the world had there been a war like this. In mere moments, centuries of humanity and culture would be targeted and obliterated. Ancient towns would be blown out of existence, an entire generation devastated. Every human soul involved in this tragedy would leave some personal imprint of their time here. Some would make their mark just by surviving. Others would leave inconsolable families or alter forever the lives of orphan sons and daughters, leaving a generation of adult grandchildren to search for memories in a gallery of foreign graveyards. In all, 20 million people would die here, each of them leaving something. John McCrae would leave a poem which would be memorized and recited by soldiers in the trenches and handed down as part of our ceremony of remembrance. But while the poem would stay with us, the life of the man who wrote it, like millions of other lives lost here, would eventually slip from our memory, become just another shadow in a mostly forgotten war. We'd forget the details of his life. John McCrae was born in middle-class Guelph, Ontario in 1872. The second son in a family of 3. His mother was a daughter of a Scots Presbyterian minister. His father, a farmer and mill owner who was known in the town as the man who founded the local militia unit. Although both he and his older brother Tom would be trained as doctors, John McCrae was brought up as a soldier, the best drilled cadet in Ontario in 1887, aged 15. As was the custom, the Presbyterian McCraes went to church at least once every Sunday. And when he got to the University of Toronto, where the raging debate was whether mankind had been placed on Earth by God, or if the upstart Charles Darwin was right about his new theory of evolution, John McCrae came down firmly on the side of God. It was while he was a student here that John McCrae fell in love for the first and what would appear to be the only time. Her name was also McCrae, Alice McCrae, no relation, and according to all sources, very beautiful.
She was his first girlfriend. I mean, he obviously was deeply in love with her. She was probably 18, he was probably about 21, and so on. And then she died in the days when people did suddenly die of infection. So here we have a wonderful girl, a sort of budding relationship, and then suddenly it snapped out.
She died of typhoid. She was only 19, and they had become quite close friends. I think obviously he'd met her through his friend and her brother, and it appears that he was very profoundly affected by her death. It was a shock, and it upset him greatly.
No picture or photograph remains of young Alice McCrae. All we have is John's entry in his diary following her funeral.
So this is where her grave will be. Through the long nights when the cold winds wake the grey-eyed morn, and when the sunless afternoons are deepening into the cheerless dark, when the summer rain drips from the trees and the cold winter breaths sigh through the bare branches.
And I wonder sometimes whether the experience with Alice and her sudden death sort of maybe made him a little bit uncertain with women. It certainly, it was a very hard burden for him to face at that age.
John McCrae would never marry. He eventually graduated with a medical degree and got a job in the newly created pathology department at McGill University in Montreal. But within a year, he was packing to leave. War had broken out in South Africa in 1899, and John McCrae wanted to be part of it. But he would go not as a doctor, he would go as a soldier.
It's interesting, isn't it? And if one asks oneself the question why, I think it has to be because he had been in the militia since he was a teenager. He'd been commissioned as a lieutenant in the militia back in 1893, and I think his sense of adventure and perhaps his desire to find out what real soldiering was all about was, I think, drove him to want to perhaps set medicine aside and go off and find out and go and fight as a soldier rather than be there as a medical officer.
242 Canadians would die in the Boer War, but John McCrae survived and came back to Montreal late in 1900. This was the golden age of medicine, and by the end of the first decade of the century, John McCrae was highly regarded as both a doctor with a private practice and as a teacher of pathology at McGill's University Hospital. He contributed to the most learned medical textbooks of his time, and his autopsy records, written in his own hand, are still kept in the famous Osler Library. He was also accepted by the Canadian literati as a poet of some promise. John McCrae was a popular bachelor doctor, much sought after by the hostesses along Montreal's Golden Mile, where the richest people in Canada competed with each other for holding the biggest parties in the biggest houses.
It was the Golden Mile Society at its most golden, with great dinners and lavish banquets and receptions, theater parties, everything that they could think of to match the glitter of London society or New York society. And in that world, John McCrae, the handsome, articulate, veteran doctor who could in full dress appear with his South African war medals, what an attraction for a hostess who needed an eligible man to sit next to Auntie Sophie or to Mrs. McGillicuddy, whose husband had died. He is an asset of unmeasurable quality in that society.
In the summer of 1914, John McCrae was sailing to England on vacation. So he wasn't in London on August the 4th, when the crowd celebrated the declaration of war by throwing their hats in the air and destroying local German-owned businesses. Neither was he in Munich a couple of days earlier, when captured in the crowd, anxious to hear news of the impending war, would be a young man named Adolf Hitler. In Canada, with a population of only 8 million, nearly 500,000 men would end up in uniform. John McCrae would be one of them, although at 42, he was much older than the average volunteer.
He believed this was a just cause and an important one, and because of his activity in the reserves, how would he have felt if other people went and he didn't go in the biggest war his lifetime would ever see? And what man of 42 really tells his friends that I'm past it? In fact, the 40s are the time when you really want to prove that you still can do it as a man. I'm sure he thought it would be a tremendous adventure, and remember, he and most others believed that they would be home in a matter of months.
Almost everyone in the civilized world believed the war would be over by Christmas. Almost everyone was wrong. The Canadian troops arrived in England in October 1914. 30,000 officers and men and 7,000 horses. John McCrae had been given the rank of major and a horse named Bonfire. He was to be assigned as senior medical officer, but he was also to be second in command of the 1st Brigade Canadian Field Artillery. The Canadians had spent their summer going through preliminary training in Valcartier, Quebec, and were convinced that they were ready for action. But the British High Command didn't share their view and moved them instead into a tent city on the Salisbury Plains, where they devised special exercises to bring them up to the British standard. The troops soon settled in and reported to Major McCrae that it was just like camping.
Then, of course, the English winter descended. A wetter than average, warmer than average winter on the whole. And the tents were soon sodden, and so were their contents, and so were the men inside them. It was a pretty good preparation for what trench warfare would be like. In fact, some of the Valcartier, some of the Salisbury Plain survivors said it was worse than the trenches would ever be. Certainly it was wet and cold and miserable as an English winter can be. And in the middle of it, here is a brigade, a division of amateurs trying to get trained, trying to learn how to use their weapons, how to do tactics, how to survive in bad conditions.
Now, I think the British were very suspicious of colonial troops. Somebody described the Canadian 1st Division or Expeditionary Force as a mob of farmers on a bunch of green horses, which is typical sort of British arrogance. I mean, you couldn't get more arrogant than that. And even when they went to France for the first time, once they got there, General Haig told them to pretend to be British, because he said, look, if the Germans know you're Canadians, they're just going to walk all over you.
Life in the tents was miserable. Many of the horses brought from Canada had to be shot after standing too long in the mud. The Canadian-made boots leaked, and the heavy greatcoats couldn't dry. The kilts would cake with mud and cut the backs of their legs as they marched. The rifles they were issued jammed and were difficult to operate. To make matters even worse, Colonel Sam Hughes, Canada's Minister of Defense, had insisted that no alcohol be permitted in the camp, not even beer.